Welcome back, everyone. We're going to get started. As we mentioned earlier today, we were also broadcasting on Google Hangout, which is allowing people to give us comments. And so what we thought we would do right now is address some of the questions that have come up. Maybe we'll do one or two. They are on topics that we have already covered, but we didn't pause to raise them at the time. So I'm going to go ahead and let Stephanie at least bring up one that came in that was pretty interesting.
So one of the questions that came in as we were talking about privacy, we've all heard the scenario out there of a robotic taxi. And so the question came is, really, what are the privacy rights that are extended in those instances of vehicles that are not privately owned, but you might have an individual who sits in that robotic taxi, and what right do they have to either opt in or opt out to have details about their travels captured by that robotic taxi?
And if you go on that a little bit, does the driver of the vehicle control the opt-in or opt-out? For example, I take a friend to lunch, and I do the opt-in. Am I opting in for anyone else that's also in my vehicle? We don't necessarily have answers to that. It's a great question, and it gives us an example of things that we need to think about as we maybe operate off of some of the ideas that we hear today. So with a question like that, who controls it in that autonomous taxi? We don't necessarily have an answer, but I think the point is that it's a great question, and it's also something that we'll have to think about as we go on into the future. One of the other questions that we talked about a little bit earlier this morning, things about like, and we talked about it in the definitions phase. What is it? What's the definition of something like a valet parking, where a vehicle would have some opportunity to park itself? And one of the questions that we got was, would DMV regs apply in private parking lots? Great question. I don't know the answer, because we have to start looking into how private parking lots are regulated. But would there be some capability that even if a garage had additional functionalities, would our regulations cover how the vehicles operate in that? So that's another thing that we're going to have to think about as we get into the future. I think one of the biggest topics that we got a lot of questions on is in the area of cybersecurity, and not necessarily in the mode of what we had been talking about, which we kind of linked it with thinking of privacy. But I think a lot of people are concerned about what is the safety guarantees that, a vehicle with some, no matter what level it is, some autonomous technology is going to be safe from being hacked. And how can you DMV, through your regulations, at least guarantee some additional safety with respect to that area? I don't know, and it's great that I have all of you here. So I'd like to get some, spend just a little bit more time talking about cybersecurity. Yeah, you want to raise with respect to that?
No.
Okay. So with that, I mean, one of the concerns is how do we address something like that in a regulation? We're not necessarily looking to create new standards. If there are standards that we should be looking at, suggestions on that would be wonderful. But again, our biggest concern is how do we make sure that when we get a certification or we get an application, that additional steps have been taken to make sure that the vehicle can't somehow be taken over by someone who doesn't have everyone else's safe interests at heart. Anybody? Any takers?
Steve's going up there.
Hi, Steve Psycho, Chrysler. So right after lunch, hopefully I won't stumble over my words here.
That's okay.
Had a nice big lunch, but I guess with respect to cybersecurity, it's you look at obviously the IT world has been focused on that for quite some time, and what you see is numerous basically a continuous activity. So what just in my observations, it would be difficult to place a hard and fast requirement on certain aspects of it, simply because it's a continually evolving thing. So if you said, for example, 128-bit encryption, well, that might be obsolete by the time the ink is dry on the regulation. So in instances like that where things they don't lend themselves to a lot of prescriptiveness, it's more along the lines of trying to wrap something around high-level principles or guidelines. So that would be my 2 cents there.
What about something that where you're certifying to that you have a process to continually observe and look at the cybersecurity of the systems that you're integrating into the vehicle? Not necessarily that there's a standard, but that we have a process that we're going to go through to take whatever steps necessary.
That may be a solution, yeah.
Steve, I also want to get your thoughts with regard to software upgrades and the security around those upgrades and how you would think would be the most appropriate way to deliver those upgrades to the different vehicles, either remotely or have customers come into a shop for those upgrades, and just interested in where
Yeah, I'm
your
not
thoughts on
prepared
that.
to talk about that. I'm not an expert on the software upgrade aspect of it. I do know that we have security options in place for those kind of, that kind of activity. Particularly with the software reflashes on say, powertrain control modules. So there's algorithms that, we already have in place to protect for that. Simply because we deal with, from the aspect of software reflashes that are not authorized. You've heard of the tuner situation where somebody wants to increase the horsepower and torque of their engine. Those can be harmful, and then what happens is we see warranty come back at us for that. So we've put protections in place to protect for that. But so it is possible, but I guess I would leave it at that.
Okay.
Because that's one of the things that we're concerned about is that, we know that the technology is going to be developing, and what you may buy in 2015 may be under some constant development. And one of our concerns is how will those upgrades be transmitted to that end user vehicle? Will they have to bring it in? Is it something that would be cloud-based? And then the concern with something like that is, if you can push upgrades, software upgrades to the car, remotely through the cloud, would that somehow make it more susceptible to some type of a security threat? So again, that's one of those questions that we don't have answers to. But even if you don't have anything you want to say about it today, there's our email address on the bottom of the agenda. We really appreciate any comments as we move forward.
John Tillman, Mercedes. First, you should probably talk to Tesla. They actually do upgrade their software wirelessly when the car's parked. So they're experts. They're already doing it. We have good people within our company that can also talk to you about it, and much more detail than I can. Second, I'm a little concerned that maybe DMV isn't the right regulating agency to regulate cybersecurity issues. There's a point where you're regulating the car, you're regulating the use of the vehicle, but cybersecurity, that's a different level that maybe you shouldn't be involved in.
What would you propose?
I'm not sure at this point, but I just don't think DMV is the right regulating agency to deal with cybersecurity. That would probably require another building this size full of people to deal with it.
Hi, Dan Frakes, General Motors. Just to add on to the comments here, General Motors definitely has this on our radar and something we're working towards and working on actively. The other thing that I'd mention is that we're looking to leverage organizations like the SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers, to create industry standards around cybersecurity, and as was mentioned earlier, continue to have it evolve as we progress into the future. But I think, from our standpoint, we're focused on it, but we're trying to leverage and encourage other folks to work through SAE to create standards around it.
Excellent, thank you. Russ?
So, Ross Good from Chrysler. So, to the points that are made here, all of us have at least probably 2 or 3 devices with us right now that are dealing with the cybersecurity issue. To think that automobiles through the DMV in California is going to solve this issue, I think is a pretty big stretch, right? So we'll all have to take advantage of the experts in the cybersecurity world to address this for a small segment of the cybersecurity world, that being automated vehicles. So it's a pretty big reach for the DMV to take this one on.
Well, if you think about it logically, one of the things that I get concerned about is nobody can hack my iPhone and make it crash several other cars on the 405 freeway during rush hour traffic. But what we would be worried about is the safety realm of someone being able to do that to a vehicle. And so it may sound like a stretch, but it is, when we talk about what do we do to make sure that the operation of vehicles that we license to go on the roads are safe, I think that's something that the statute calls for us to be concerned about.
They can crash your cell phone though and turn your financial life in ruin. So I mean, there's other big stakes at play here.
Yeah, but I'd still be alive.
California has sort of led the nation in passing data breach notification laws. And there are now bills coming out that would, among other things, perhaps set a sort of a ceiling level of industry-based data security rules. And it seems to me that it's appropriate for the DMV to have that sort of language suggesting that to meet standards you need to adhere to some outside experts level of cybersecurity. And that's a perfectly appropriate thing to do for the reasons that you've been citing about safety and so on. But there also may well be other laws that control data breaches and cybersecurity that come into broader play that could be applicable too. But I do think it's fine to have the DMV should take some sort of position on this is the kind of generally accepted level of protection that we would expect.
And maybe it is as the comment suggested, is that it's something that, for example, manufacturers are working with the Society of Automotive Engineers to even think about, how do we come up with standards for it? And maybe it's a reach out for us to see where they are and what are some of their thoughts about what they're developing. Sorry, go ahead.
Excuse me, Barbara Wendling with Volkswagen. I would just add that cybersecurity is a front and center topic in the connected vehicle space, and NHTSA is heavily involved in that at a federal level, working with the Federal Trade Commission and FCC, et cetera. So again, it's not a unique issue like privacy. It's not unique to automated vehicles. It covers a lot of other existing aspects of vehicles. So again, not to belittle the DMV's role, but if somebody else already has it handled, maybe it's not something you need to burden yourself with.
Yeah, and I think for us, the concern is that we're developing regulations that have to go into effect by January of next year. And where are all of those efforts that as they dovetail, are they all going to magically hit for us by June of this year such that we could have it in our regulations that would go into effect as of January 1 of next year? Maybe not, but maybe there's some information that we can get from them that would assist us in our drafting process.
So, well, I think we all understand that it's a really complex subject, right? And that there is no standard that's written that kind of sort of guarantees it. And it is like a process that continually gets dealt with every day by major corporations trying to stay ahead of those people that are trying to get into systems. But I think that it's complex because a lot of it depends on kind of the architecture of the software and how you sort of partition pieces that depend on other pieces. And so it's not just an encryption piece. It is a very complicated piece of a problem that companies like Google, are dealing with every day. And so I think that one worry is that there's an expectation that you can write something that can really adequately deal with it, right? I mean, I think that I understand your interest, and it's an interest that NHTSA and others have about cybersecurity. No one quite knows how to write a requirement for it yet. The requirements that are sort of written now may not be, something that's going to be state of the art in the next year or two. And so I think that, what I think everybody's saying is maybe not that you shouldn't pay attention to it because somebody else could do it better or differently or something, but I think just the caution is that no one quite knows how to do it in a way that's going to be, quote, fully protective, and there's no one kind of thing that you can write that will assure that would help. And so the question is, I think that, giving a certification that steps have been taken to do it would be, could be there, but a question is, how secure do you feel with that, and how robust could that be? And I think that's the worry about, like, how do you write this in a regulation that is going to be carried forth for years to come, ensuring that it's still secure in cyberspace. And so I think that is the huge challenge, I think. And I don't know that we have any perfect answers. I think we worry about writing something very prescriptive that would be kind of out of date and insufficient, right? I think you're worried about that too. So I think that, the way many companies do it is a variety of ways. Encryption's one, basically having on board the software that drives the vehicle and does most of the safety critical operation that's not being transmitted is another way of doing it. So there's just a lot of different processes that could help ensure, or at least reduce the possibility of having a cyber attack. But so I think I just worry that trying to figure out a requirement that you could write would provide the protection that might be necessary, right? So that companies like ours are going to continually to work on ensuring that we have adequate protection. But,
And maybe that is what the answer is.
Yeah.
That there's some assurance that it is a process that's continually going on to try and figure out how to provide that protection, because we couldn't. Maybe I could write something that says by January 1, 2015, you better have something that completely protects against cybersecurity. Is it realistic that would happen, or is it a safer bet to have something that says at least a requirement that you're taking steps that could make sure it's as secure as possible?
That seems like a reasonable thing to write. Yeah.
Okay. We thought that a good place, and we spent about 20 minutes on some topics that we may have covered already this morning, but we were going to move in this afternoon on page 3 of the outline with Roman numeral 3, which was the safety standards. We did some talking about it earlier today. Item 1 under that topic mentions a manufacturer safety officer and submission of a manufacturer safety plan. And so that comes up with the thought process is, as we talk about additional safety standards, manufacturers having the flexibility of talking about, of identifying to us what safety standards that they've developed for their technology, maybe giving us a safety plan and identifying someone that we would be able to contact if there was an issue that came up that was brought to the department's attention. And so I think that's the purpose of that section. It kind of meshes in talking about third-party certifications. But I think what our whole goal here is this section is, how do we assure ourselves that the manufacturers themselves have somewhat of a safety plan and someone that's designated in the manufacturer's operations that the department would be able to contact to address issues with respect to that. So I'd like to hear if any comments or concerns with respect to having a requirement like that.
So, Brian, I would just ask kind of, the idea of having a safety officer who you contact is a great idea. I think it's fine. The question about submission of a safety plan, I guess the question is what is, in your mind, what is that?
That's a great question,
Yeah,
Ron. What
yeah.
would you suggest it?
Well, I think a safety plan could be many things to many people, and the process of developing an autonomous vehicle has lots of pieces associated with it, and there's kind of a functional safety engineering process that's followed by companies that develop products. So I I guess the most important thing, I think, is that, the company's done adequate testing and is ready to, after that testing, submit an application and then submit its product for testing, as we discussed today, right? So that, because a plan doesn't really assure safety in any way, because it's just a kind of a plan that shows how you went about developing it, but the process itself, in terms of whether it was executed correctly and whether you have a product that's really safe, is really more dependent on its performance and in the field, right? So I'm just wondering whether that is something that's useful. I'm not quite sure what you had in mind, and maybe others here have suggestions, but.
Anyone else with suggestions? I mean, what, one of the things when you think about, and you talked about the manufacturer had a safety plan, and when you think about it, that's maybe that went into the development of it and what's been tested, but wouldn't a safety plan also cover what you're going to do if something happens with the technology, if there's a failure that is, I don't want to call it a system-wide, but it's a failure that could be common to maybe all the vehicles that you have. What is your plan after that? You know, we're necessarily dealing with a technology that doesn't meet a federal standard, so maybe there isn't a capacity to have a federal recall of it. And so how would we satisfy ourselves that you're doing something to address what may be a safety issue that would come up in the future?
So that it's something along, what would we do if we found a safety problem, and how would we mitigate a safety
Exactly.
problem that we found? Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
You know, like, what steps are you taking
Yeah.
as you discover things? How are you alerting owners or purchasers? How are you handling how improvements may be pushed out to the vehicle such that those issues are addressed?
Okay.
Things like that. So when you think of a safety plan, you're thinking even more broader, you know, like not just how did you test it, but what are you going to do if something happens?
Okay, that's, okay, I understand now, okay.
Go ahead, Barb.
I'm sort of looking around here for your previous role at NHTSA, but I mean, the federal rules that govern safety defects would still apply to automated vehicles, even in the absence of specific regulations by NHTSA that address automated vehicles. So if there turned out to be a safety defect, whether or not it was part of the automated technology, and even if it was, you would have to comply with federal recall and remedy requirements.
Right, right.
And we would hope that would happen, so I don't read articles like I did from the New York Times on Sunday about safety defects and not getting addressed, right?
Yeah.
Bernard had
Okay.
an interesting comment that he was
Right.
going to bring up.
So there was a comment that just came over on Twitter, and it speaks to the operator responsible for ensuring the vehicle obeys all traffic laws. But the actual comment that came over was in the form of a question. Under the regs, will the first autonomous vehicles sold commercially need to have someone in the driver's seat? So that was the question that came up.
And I think that's one of the issues that, you know, we're grappling with the regulations, because, you know, for testing, we know that a person has to be sitting in the driver's seat. We know that the way the statute is written, it's open enough that it wouldn't necessarily require a driver being, or a person being in the driver's seat. But it leaves somewhat leeway, and I had this discussion earlier when we were talking about definitions. You know, gee, if in the application process we don't receive sufficient information to let us feel that it is, or to make a determination that it's safe for a vehicle by a specific manufacturer to be operated safely without a person in it, we may not approve that application. The issue becomes, how do we satisfy ourselves of that? I think it's a great question. I don't necessarily have an answer sitting here today, but it is something that we're thinking about, and that's why we had that discussion earlier today. You know, what would we need to see? What would we require in an application to satisfy ourselves, even based on the testing that a manufacturer may have already done, that a complete level 4 or level 5, depending on what definition that you use, vehicle is safe for operation on the streets? See a lot of head nodding. So I guess everybody agrees with me. Yes, go ahead.
This is a question to the group that's actually come in via the Google Hangout. So as it relates to safety and certification, there was a question asked, should there be separate rules for retrofitted vehicles because manufacturers will not be involved in converting those vehicles into an autonomous vehicle? Any comments, thoughts from the group?
Those retrofits, Brian, they would be subject to the testing and they'd be subject to the same regulations, right? So the process would be followed.
Should there be separate in addition to?
I think probably what we would have to do is dive back into the definitions of the statute. And so if you think about it, your very rich hobbyist in his garage retrofits somebody else's vehicle with some autonomous technology. when you start doing that, you get into the definition that that person has now become a manufacturer. And would they have to go through all of the same process that Mercedes-Benz or Volkswagen or Google, Chrysler or GM would have to go through in order to be able to, one, first start testing the vehicles on the street, and then would that hobbyist have to apply to us for an application to now operate that vehicle on the streets? It may be that as we delve back into the law, they'd have to meet all the same requirements. Yeah. Any thoughts on that? Okay, again, head nod, so everybody agrees with me. When we talked about safety standards before, and we had some mention about the fact that vehicles are going to have different performance capabilities based on the level of autonomous technology that's in it. And we number 5 on our outline for safety standards is, are there matters that the department should consider necessary based on the level of autonomy, including whether to require a driver present in the vehicles? And I guess what that is aiming to is, while we know that there's going to be various different types of technologies, how do we recognize something like that in a regulation and have something common enough that we can apply standards across the board to different technologies and different levels that may be coming to us?
So there, I mean, I think clearly the distinction between what I call level 3 and level 4, which is a driver available to be transitioning back in versus a vehicle that has no driver and therefore not available to transition back in, is that the vehicle will be able to demonstrate that without a driver that it can do the kinds of things that a driver that would have been asked to take over can do, so that there has to be kind of the ability to identify when there is an intervention necessary and an ability to take the intervention, right? So that there will be a demonstration in the application that can happen and that the vehicle can do it. So I think that the idea that you don't need a driver is certainly one that a company and a manufacturer should demonstrate through its testing, and most importantly through the information it submits in the application that shows why it believes so, and then demonstrates it through what we think is a driving test of the vehicle.
Are there specific types of reports or documents that we should look for to be submitted with an application? 'Cause, you imagine that manufacturers are going to be doing, they're going to be doing testing, they're going to satisfy themselves. So should we be looking for a report that comes in with the application, some data submitted to us that comes in with the application? What do you think we should do?
Yeah, so there's going to be information collected by the manufacturer doing this testing that allows it to be convinced at some point that we're beyond the testing, we're ready to operate. And I personally don't have the kind of a recommendation to you of like, okay, if you just do X, Y, and Z, then you're okay, right? And give me data on X, Y, and Z, and I think it's the whole thing, right? That you have therefore demonstrated in your testing, satisfying yourselves that you have that you're prepared to operate in whatever form you want, level 3 or level 4. And I'm not quite sure which piece of data that you should get that would satisfy you. I think that the company itself will have demonstrated, collected data and done analysis and then ready to submit its vehicle for your testing is kind of the proof that it's ready, I think.
I think that along the lines of self-certification, the manufacturer should be able to tell you whether or not the application or vehicle driving system combination is designed for truly driverless operation. So, you're saying level 4, I'm using the SAE parlance. Level 5, where a vehicle could drive absolutely anywhere that a human driver can legally drive a vehicle on road today. That's kind of a high end, and that's probably a ways off, but we don't even have to argue about that. But let's put that one aside for a second. You have level 3 and 4. Those are conditional. They only operate in certain modes or in certain roads or in certain conditions, daylight, no rain, whatever it is. And in that case, you assume that because they're conditional, they're designed to be driven sometimes by drivers, sometimes by not, unless it's, say, a dedicated closed campus shuttle, in which case it may be designed with no driver's seat at all, right? It's a drone essentially, but it operates in this closed environment that's fully mapped out and set up for it. So again, I think the manufacturer can tell you what the application is, what it's designed for, and hopefully satisfy you that, was done appropriately.
There are a number of tweets that just came through with regard to mapping information. And so this is a question for the group. Should we consider any regulations with regard to the maps that are used? Some of you are using technologies that are heavily reliant on maps, and should there be some sort of regulations that we should consider around those maps, particularly either annotating the maps or the inclusion with live information on those maps? And so it's just an open question for the group.
Yeah, so I say no, because the ability to drive safe and relying on the maps are all sort of intertwined. You can't do one without the other, and separate regulations on maps, which could quickly be outdated and irrelevant, would be kind of an impediment to the further development of maps, and unnecessary really, because of you can't, if the maps don't work right and you're relying on those maps to drive safely, then you can't drive safely if they don't work correctly. So I think that I don't see a need for separate regulations in this area.
Okay. One of the comments that we had gotten earlier, and it's kind of keying off what Barbara mentioned about like the drone shuttle type of a scenario, which are usually low speed vehicles. And one of the comments that we got this morning was, should the department contemplate the fact that there may be some low-speed, completely autonomous vehicles that at some points have to interact with faster traffic? And, how are you going to address that scenario, DMV? So it's a question that's been asked of us, and so I'm going to pose that to you, my captive audience. Especially, for example, in Barbara's drone scenario, should we be concerned about the fact that there may be vehicles with capabilities that are operating out there, at least safe for what they're doing, but somehow coming across scenarios where they're actually operating in a mode that's not safe for the other traffic around it? Best example would be a vehicle that, like the drone Barbara mentioned, with no operator in it, that's driving very slowly, and it's now having to interact with traffic that's going much faster.
A vehicle that's not operating safely for the vehicles around it isn't operating safely.
So Andrew is in favor of just like completely banning them?
No, I think, if you come across the conclusion that something isn't safe, then that's sort of, there's a period at the end of that sentence, I think. If you're not safe for the people around you, you are not a safe driver. If a vehicle...
And so once we get an application for a vehicle that operates that way, how do we assure ourselves that it will only be operating in the modes, like, for example, you're a low-speed vehicle.
So you're
only going to operate, and I'll use like the golf carts out at Sun City. They want to cross Douglas Boulevard. How do we?
Well, that's conditional, and that's a great example. Golf carts are legal in California. We register golf carts to be operated in California, but they can only be used on roads with a speed limit of 25 miles an hour. So I think you have to look at it in that context. Mm-hmm. But your original premise was just, if we decide that this is a vehicle that doesn't operate safely for the vehicles around it, then I think that's an unsafe vehicle.
Well, I guess, though, and you're probably familiar with it, we often get the pressures that come with after allowing something. It's like, well, wait a minute, now I want to use it someplace else where it actually shouldn't be going. Like the golf carts are a great example of that.
And then I think, then we have to think about a legal scheme around operation that can be altered on demonstrations of safety.
Brian, just from conversations prior to lunch, I think that's probably already handled under one of the headlines of operating within all the laws, state laws of rules of California on roadways. So I think that kind of already answers that question.
Excellent, thank you. Oh, all the commenters are asking us. We had number 4 on this under safety standards. How will traffic points be assessed? I think the concern of that is and I'm not sure if our friends from insurance are still here, is currently under our insurance regime, the way your rates are based on is how well you drive. Also for us, for driver's licensing purposes, you know, your points impact whether or not we continue to allow you to have a driver's license. So the issue becomes, gee, who's responsible when the vehicle somehow gets a violation for which a point would normally be assessed? Does the operator of that vehicle, does the owner of that vehicle get a pass? An interesting video Bernard showed me several weeks ago was a person that had put their car in self-park in a parking lot in Florida, and it crashed and was sitting on top of another vehicle, and of course the driver said it was the car's fault. Are we going to be faced with that scenario into the future? Well, I wasn't speeding, the car did it. And once that ticket happens, who gets the responsibility on a driving record? Because that's basically how we regulate drivers in California. It's on the basis of what violations they occurred. And since we're talking about a new technology that's going to be taking over that function, who bears the responsibility? Go ahead, Barbara.
Barb Wendling, Volkswagen. I think we have cases of that today, right? I mean, where we come out with a new lighting technology and it's federally certified and the states look at it and say, hey, wait, no, that's too bright or it doesn't meet or something. And then the driver gets a ticket and they come back to the manufacturer and the manufacturer proves that it's legal and it's certified and the ticket goes away. Obviously, we don't like to have to do that, but we do deal with that today. And of course, we do everything we can to make sure that that doesn't happen. And we would certainly do that with an automated vehicle too, you know, minimize the possibility that our owners would get, you know, ticketed for some violation. But when it happens, there's existing precedent for how to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so for the presence of a driver, it seems like the driver's responsibility for doing it, and they'd get a ticket. I don't know whether they could argue that, well, I was in autonomous mode at the time it happened and it was a vehicle's fault. I don't know how quite to resolve that, but there is a driver that you can ticket. For a vehicle for which there is no driver and you can't immediately hand that person a ticket, it seems to us that that the person is there for the corporation, and the corporation who built that vehicle to respond to those traffic laws that may have been violated then bears the responsibility for the penalty that is associated with it.
How concerned should we be? You know, one of the focuses of law over the last several years with the advent of people using cell phones, and you know, you can't text while driving, you can't use a cell phone while driving, you can't have a video display in the front of the vehicle where you're not paying attention. How do we dovetail all of those requirements with the possibility that people will be tempted to do other things which right now may not necessarily be legal? I mean, you know, one of the benefits that we often see about this is like I can read my newspaper as I'm driving to work, or I could work on my laptop. Is that something that, you know, while the vehicle is capable of doing that, is that something that our laws currently recognize that you can do?
That's a great question, I think. I mean, I think that the burden is on the company that is basically saying you don't need to monitor driving because we have reached a level of autonomy that it's not necessary, and therefore you can do other things away from driving. And that the ability of that company to have a human-to-machine interface that can transition you back in a timely way to taking manual control is responsible for demonstrating that that can be done in a variety, you know, for a variety of, you know, it may not be texting or phoning, but you could be reading the paper. You know, there's lots of ways in which you no longer have to monitor driving, and I think that, you know, the manufacturer is going to have to demonstrate in some fashion that transitioning back into manual control can be done effectively, and in the scenarios that you just mentioned, right? So that's how I think the burden should be on the company to be able to get your attention back.
Is there some concern that and one of the things the reason why I bring up that point is there's nothing that we can do in a regulation that addresses what those statutes may require, because a regulation only has the authority that's conferred upon it by statute. We can't expand the scope of some other law, and we can't by our regulation somehow contract the scope of what may be some other statute. And so the reason why I raise that is as we have all of those requirements, things like you can't text and drive and you can't operate certain types of technology while you're driving. What is the impact on those requirements that may face, the wide-scale operation of self-driving vehicles? And at least the benefits that people now seem to feel that they're going to get from it. I will be able to play with my iPad while I'm driving my kids to school. I don't know if you can currently do that under California law.
Yeah, yeah. I think you can't, right?
I hope you can't.
Yeah, right.
Especially since my car isn't autonomous. Andrew?
I was just going to raise that point you made about negating or expanding. Sorry. I was just going to raise that point that you made about expanding or contracting existing laws. Technically, points are assessed based upon conviction by a court. So I don't think there's anything, you can say it was in autonomous mode. It wasn't. We can decide that people aren't responsible for things that happen when a vehicle's in autonomous mode. But if a judge convicts someone of a citation, there are points assessed.
Okay. So Andrew's response is, tell it to the judge.
And I really think that's the best way for it to be
Yeah.
argued,
Yeah, I
is
agree.
litigated in a situational
I agree.
context.
I agree completely.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ed.
I just wanted to follow up, make sure I heard something correctly. So, obviously, we've been talking about when, under the statute, the capability of the technology even triggers the application of the regulations that we have for testing or the regulations that we're discussing today. I think, we have an understanding about, obviously, depending upon where a particular manufacturer is in their process, the technology will have varying capabilities. So obviously, we talked about, being able to travel, function in autonomous mode on city streets potentially, but not on highway, or the reverse. Different types of climate it may operate, it may not. So the question that I have, because one of the requirements in the statute is that when we receive an application whereby, and I'll be very specific here, so they are seeking approval for autonomous vehicles capable of operating without the presence of a driver inside the vehicle. We are required to provide that application information to the legislature. They have 180 days to act upon it, and they will process that application in the meantime. So I just wanted to clarify, are we thinking that it has to be, if you will, level 4, level 5, or any ability to be driverless? So even going down to the two scenarios we've kind of talked about today, which is the parking valet and or a low-speed scenario. So I wasn't quite sure, based upon some of the terms that we've been talking about today, kind of what the interpretation of the different manufacturers might be as to, again, when DMV is obligated to, you will, package that up and send it to the legislature for their consideration.
I was assuming that it's anytime you're operating on California public roads without a driver in the vehicle, right? No matter whether it's restricted use or not, but it's under those conditions in which they were anticipated to be notified, right?
I mean, that would seem to be a logical interpretation. It's like at any point where you have a vehicle that is capable of operating on a public road, as that term is defined, without a driver in it. And so I think Kristen's point is very well, is that we do have an obligation that once we get the application for that, we have to notify the legislature that we've gotten an application for that capability. And so it's almost like you're not going to get an automatic, you submitted it, and then we turned around and approved it. We have a requirement that we have to wait 180 days. Sorry.
Is the definition, the John Simpson from Consumer Watchdog, is the definition of a driver being in the car mean a person who's still physically engaged, or is it, I mean, is a driver in the car if there's a person who potentially could take over if the technology failed?
Well, what the point that Kristen is raising is that the statute says that if we get an application that seeks approval for autonomous vehicles capable of operating without the presence of a driver inside the vehicle, the department may impose additional requirements, blah, 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 and may require the presence of a driver in the vehicle. But then that section also says, approval of the application shall be effective no sooner than 180 days after the date of the application. Another sentence in that, the department shall notify the legislature of receipt of an application from a manufacturer seeking approval to operate an autonomous vehicle capable of operating without the presence of a driver. And that's the important thing here.
But does the driver have to be driving the car?
Well, we have the authority to require it, but what they're basically asking is if someone is filing an application that says we're going to put cars on the street, that will not require a driver to be physically in there to operate the vehicle, then we have to notify the legislature.
And I think Kristen's also, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're also extending that to the self-parking vehicles, that valet parking, because no one is in those vehicles as it finds a parking spot and parks itself.
I think that's certainly an interpretation, Bernard.
Right.
And again, just based upon some of the terms that I heard, I wasn't sure if everybody was having that interpretation or not.
Right.
If they were thinking, no, not until it is completely driverless capable. Whether there's, times obviously in which a driver, could be in there. Certainly there, in theory, would be a passenger in there at times as well. I just wasn't sure if that's what everybody was interpreting that provision to be.
Barbara Wendling with Volkswagen. I think I'm going to agree with what was just been said, but I just want to clarify again. If the manufacturer tells you this application is designed to be truly no driver in the vehicle, then you'll know that, right? Because it's a closed campus shuttle, or it's designed to do one route back forth and nothing else, and it's, programmed for that. Or it's level 5, right? It could go anywhere on road that a human driver can legally drive a vehicle today, cross any state line, and it doesn't matter. Otherwise, we're talking about something like traffic jam pilot, where the person gets into the vehicle, drives it to the freeway, then suddenly there's a traffic jam, and they say, okay, I'm going to turn this thing on, and it'll do that. And of course, you have a driver in the car because they have to be there to turn it on, and they have to be there to take over, and when it's no longer appropriate to have it on.
So Barbara, back to the self-parking issue. Do you feel that if VW provides us an application for a vehicle and a feature of that vehicle is the ability to self-park by itself, that we would be obligated to notice the legislature of that application?
As we discussed before, the way the law is written, probably if it's, as you said, a valet, a true automated valet, where, I put it in that mode and say, go park yourself, and it leaves my line of sight and goes someplace, right? And then I come back out and I retrieve it with no line of sight, then yes, that's automated and it's driverless, right?
Okay. Thank you.
We seem to be getting a lot of interest when we start talking about assessing points and things like that. And it's one that I often have been struggling with for over a year now is what do we do with respect to an intoxicated driver? Our statutes talk about, no one shall drive a vehicle under the influence of alcohol. We're using a phrase that's operator. And, California is one of the few states, only one other, whose drunk driver laws speak of driving under the influence of alcohol, and our and the courts have defined that as, requiring volitional movement and making a distinction between other states that have no one shall operate a vehicle under the influence of alcohol. And so we're now starting to delve into a realm that is kind of murky for us, and we're getting questions about, how do the drunk driver laws apply to a vehicle that is operating autonomously, especially if you're using a definition that it is the operator who's operating the vehicle, which we already know in decisions that we've had is that our statutes are based on driving. And is that something that we need to address in our regulations? But it is, as you can see, it is a problem for us. What happens is that just because you got into the car, I use the example of the person saying, well, it was in autonomous mode, or it was in the self-parking when it crashed into that other car. Well, yeah, I'm blowing a 0.16, and but it's in autonomous mode when when the officer pulled me over. Do we still have a problem with that, and how do we address that in our regulations?
I think Andrew had a suggestion. It's like tell it to the judge, right? So
Okay. We're gonna have a section of the regulations. I think we'll have to figure out how to do it, but it will be entitled, tell it to the judge.
Tell the judge, yes.
You know, I'm going to move on to what is our section 5, or I'm sorry, 4 of the outline, which
Brian,
happens
could
to
I
be-
ask,
go right ahead.
on number 2, before you do that, is, I mean, this third-party certifier, this, the idea would be that we would have a driving test instead of some third, unless you consider DMV a third-party certifier or something like that. I mean, at least that's our suggestion, and that this, we didn't really talk much about this in this session, but.
We have it, and I know we've talked about it a lot with
Yeah.
respect to our testing regulations. It is something that we're going to have to address in the deployment regulations, because there's a lot of certifications that a manufacturer has to give to us. And so I think that's always been that bug that's been sitting back behind us, is how, you know, again, how do we know? You can just tell us yes to everything, and how do we know that when you check that box yes on a form, that those certifications hold true? And again, it's that discussion, should there be someone that would, you know, a third-party verifier, whether that be a third party who tests it or a third party who verifies that the processes that you used were adequate to make the assurances that you did. You know, when you talk about certifications, one thing you always jump back to is what standards were they under?
Right.
And so, and then when you talk about DMV accepting certifications, what is DMV's capacity to test or to question those certifications? I think that's why we mentioned a discussion about third-party certifiers.
So this is something that in principle kind of goes against the self-certification process where, I mean, unless you were talking, are you talking here, at least notionally, about this being done during the process application phase?
Possibly, because
yeah.
we're getting an application that by statute requires all of those certifications that were, you know, mentioned on
Yeah.
page 2 of the outline. And so, other than someone just checking the box that says, I certify, you know, it has the system to disengage or something like that. I know you mentioned earlier, you know, basically having a test of the vehicle, take the
Right.
vehicle for a drive
Yeah,
test
yeah,
to make sure of those
yeah.
things. But I think, you know, another solution to that may be some third body making those.
Yeah, the problem, I think, one problem with the third party is that you'd have to have very clear criteria about, you know, what is it that the third party is going to require or check for, and how does a company know beforehand exactly what that auditor is going to look for. I think that this becomes, in my mind, very problematic. I think it does go against kind of the principle that we've talked about in terms of self-certification. I think this could be, anyway, I think this is an issue for us, and I still think that the best way for you to verify the safety performance under the standards area is to conduct a test, and rather than have some third party do an audit of our certifications without knowing exactly what those criteria might be and how that would be done. I think this is problematic for us, quite frankly.
Could you interpret this to sort of have a third party perform those validations, that testing process you described? For
Sure,
example, if
sure,
we-
sure.
If we had third party safety experts perform testing with the vehicles.
On your,
I mean,
on
that's
your
sort of
behalf.
within the context of
On your
verifying.
yeah.
right,
So
what
that
you've
would,
done.
sure. So rather than the DMV, but you have a party that on your behalf, I assume, on your behalf would conduct a test. I think that's okay, that's fine.
Right,
Yep, that's fine.
because our concern is
Yep.
somewhat identical to yours,
Yep.
which is like, hey, gee, if there's some third party certifying it, how do we know what standards they're using for certifying it? Well, if you're self-certifying it and you put yourself in our shoes, how do we know what standards you're using to make that self-certification, other than telling me, yes, it meets this? And we have no way of knowing that.
Right. No, okay, that makes me feel better, actually. So I understand that, in fact, if this would be a third party on your behalf conducting a driver's test about the safety of the vehicle, that would.
That's
Not
just one
necessarily
example.
that was
Well,
the
I know,
example
I
you
know,
used.
no, that's the one I'm using, right? So, but if it's something else where you're just doing a paper exercise and you're looking at paper and data for which there's complete subjectivity about whether or not this is adequate, and there's no notice about what it is that you're going to be evaluating, and there isn't a kind of objective criteria by which any company would know what to expect, and so the judgment process that a manufacturer made about whether it was adequate
versus a third party for which there's no criteria yet established. That would not be a practical, objective evaluation by a
but-
regulator, right?
Just as equally impractical as the trust us standard. And that would be
Right.
if we just had something where you just submitted to us that we had a simple application that listed all those elements that are in the statute, and you just said, I certify all that.
Right.
We wouldn't know.
Right.
I
so-
mean, we just have
yeah.
your word for it.
Right. No, I understand, but I also understand that if you send some, if we have a basis for which we made that decision, which each company will have a basis by which it makes that determination on its own, but without an audit by somebody or an evaluation of that information, without having any advanced notice about what those specific criteria are that are objective that you're going to evaluate, it wouldn't work.
But I think, if I could, I'm sorry, Stephen, I think the issue regardless is, what are the standards?
Yep.
And then based upon what the standards are, which is the proper way to vet them, if you will, or ensure that those standards have been met? Is a self-certification by the manufacturer sufficient? It may be for some, but not for all. A recommendation you had mentioned earlier was having DMV, in essence, make sure that certain standards have been met. I think another alternative is a third party, whether that's third party separate and apart from DMV or third party contracted by DMV. But regardless, the standards come first, and then, I mean, I don't need to tell you,
Right,
but I
right,
mean, that's,
right.
the standards have to be looked at regardless of whether it's the manufacturer self-certifying, DMV, or a third party.
So the way it works with NHTSA and its auto regulations is that there's a standard written and a self-certification made, and eventually at NHTSA's discretion, an enforcement, basically getting a vehicle and conducting a test, and the consequence of not complying is pretty severe because all those vehicles must be taken off the road and recalled and retrofitted in order to continue and they have to stop sale until they're fixed, right? So that's the way it works. So this is a little different than that because this is kind of a quote self-certification on the one hand, which is an assertion by a manufacturer that they've done their legal obligation, they conducted their legal obligation to certify to it, and then during the application process that there be some third party during that process decide whether or not they've met the criteria. So that's the distinction here. It's post.
I think it
Yep.
could be
Yep.
at any point
Point.
in time, meaning that
Post approval.
well, it could be prior to, or, right, I mean, in order for us to, ultimately approve your application, you either self-certify to certain things, and/or you've had a third party verify that you've met those standards. And again, you're submitting either of those two things as part of your application package, or a third option is once we receive the package, we go and certify, or we hire a third party to certify. And there's potentially some other options, but I think it could be done before or once we get it
Right.
as an application. I mean, I think
But
it's-
not post approval.
I imagine that is certainly an option as well. I mean, I think that's part of what we're
Right,
hoping
so
to hear from folks.
I mean, you mentioned and I'm sorry about that, Steve. I just want to respond to that.
It's no problem.
You mentioned the NHTSA consequences of they can always order a recall. Well, we don't have that avenue. We have an application, and so if there is a problem, is our consequence that your application is revoked and now you somehow have to stop using all those
I
vehicles?
assume it would be, right? I mean, I think that you would pull the permit if we hadn't met our legal obligations.
That would be the
But-
only leverage we would have
Right,
at that
that's
point.
big.
But you've sold 5,000 cars to people out there on the streets, and now I've got.
We can't sell any until we're certified, though.
Right, but this is after you got an
So
application
you're
process.
approved, yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
yeah.
I think what Ron's asking is you're maybe
We're just
more
gonna
akin to
open
your
it up.
current process, where you're already out, and then the feds might take action.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge, powerful tool, right? I mean, manufacturers are so diligent about not having a non-compliance issue because of the consequences of being not, but let's be clear, it is clear what the rules are, right? You know what the standard is, and you know what test you have to conduct, and you know kind of whether you passed or failed.
And so the really important thing, if there's going to be a third-party evaluation of anything, it has to have objective criteria that are known well ahead of time in order to make decisions about whether or not you can do it. Otherwise, it's just subjective by whoever's going to do the verification.
Let's let Steve
Yes,
talk. He's been
right,
waiting
yeah.
patiently.
Sorry,
there.
Steve.
No, that's fine. And I think, Ron, you touched on a lot of what I came up here to, just to impress upon it. When manufacturers talk about self-certification, in our minds, it doesn't mean check your own paper and check your own test. It's, we are in full understanding that, that is a hard and fast requirement, and that NHTSA, the organization, will spot check it. So it better be right. So just that one point, and I think we already got there. I guess the one clarification I wanted to make with number 2 on section 3, it says third-party certifier for verification of the procedure utilized by manufacturers to certify safety. So we've talked, I just want to maybe understand and clarify a little bit, because we've been talking about safety, like the performance standards, but this seems to indicate the the process by which we get there. So can you clarify as to which it?
Well, I mean, if you think about it, you're going to go through, I mean, we either have an application that says, I certify all of these things, or you will have somehow gone through some testing process, you will have some procedures that's going to satisfy you that you can make that certification. We've gone through all of these steps, and this is what we've done. We're not necessarily capable of looking at that and saying, yes, these are valid steps to have gone through to certify the safety of this product. And is that something that a third party would be better equipped to do? Not necessarily retesting your vehicle and making sure that, it meets those certifications, but maybe verifying for us that you have gone through a rather extensive process to certify that the certification that you're making is a valid certification. It's because you've followed a very valid procedure to come to that conclusion. Maybe not necessarily testing your conclusion, but looking at you went through a valid process to reach that conclusion.
Okay, thank you.
Ross, good, Chrysler. Brian, sadly, I don't think the trick is in the certification. The trick is in writing the standard. Whether we self-certify, whether we have a third-party witness, whether we have one of your contractors do it, the trick isn't in proving that we can do these things. The trick is, or the hard part is for you guys, is to write those standards.
Exactly.
That's
And we have to
exactly
have
the
them
hard
by
part.
January 1, 2015, and we have to go through a process that calls for a 45-day notice and 45 days of the Office of Administrative Law to approve it, and 15 days if we change text.
I think we'd be glad to write those rules for you, but I don't think you'd like them when we did.
But see, they would
kidding,
have
of
to be
course, but
longer
the
than
hard
one
part-
sentence.
Yeah, the hard part is going to be writing the standard. Not, the certifying is going to be easy. We'll be able to agree on that pretty easily. The hard part is going to be writing the standard.
Anyone else?
So I think that I'm a little concerned about exactly where this is headed. So I'm wondering, because these are brand-new technologies, who would be a third party that has the sufficient knowledge and capability to do this, that we would, is it someone we know, or?
I don't know. You're in business. You tell us.
No, I was just wondering, okay, so.
I know that,
you know.
that certain manufacturers that build and work on cars in countries other than in the U.S. are familiar with third-party certifiers. And I do know that the cars that certain U.S. manufacturers, they also have companies that build cars in foreign countries, and so they're familiar with third-party certifiers.
But there's
and so
no.
again, I'll answer your question with a question. I don't know. You tell us.
But there aren't any of them, quite frankly, today that are in this business, right? That have written requirements for and done audits for this level of autonomy.
But I guess the issue is, and neither has our federal government, and we're required by statute to actually look at this as something that's certified. So if you're telling me that it's something that can't be checked and can't be certified, then are you basically saying that there will be no one who will be able to make that certification. And therefore, as of January 1, 2015, we don't have to worry about approving applications for the operation of autonomous vehicles because no one will be in the position of making that certification for us.
No, no, it's not that. It's more that the need for objective criteria that establish requirements for which you're going to be evaluated. And that's why I'll go back again to the best criteria is, can you actually drive safely on public roads with that vehicle in the way that you applied to do it, and can you demonstrate that effectively? And that is kind of an objective test that can be done. But I'm worried about the objective criteria that, I'm concerned about how you are going to know, how a manufacturer like us are going to know exactly what we're going to be evaluated against.
One issue with that, though, is, I mean, a vehicle might operate safely, but does it do that by chance? Or did it do that as an outcome of a process that a manufacturer goes through? I think that's one of the things we're looking to demonstrate. The fact that the vehicle operates safely in a set of conditions doesn't mean that it did that through the purposes of the process.
But, yeah, I think it would be very hard for a vehicle to be put through a test that you would choose in a variety of environments that did it without any flaws at all, and that it kind of accidentally got developed that way, that there wasn't a systematic way in which it was developed. But the way that one company versus another company might develop a product, and then knowing what an auditor might be looking for to make a decision about, okay, this is adequate and this is not adequate, and the reason it's not adequate is. So I think that's the real worry about ensuring that we know what we're going to be evaluated against, and that's what these guys have been saying.
Well, and I guess, and I might be repeating myself, but the real worry for us is the exact opposite. You know, it's like, how do we make ourselves comfortable when we have an application that's in front of us? It's got a certification on it, that certification is sufficient such that we can say, yes, all right, we're going to approve this application, start operating these vehicles outside of a testing mode. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, touching on the third-party certifier, you're right. There are third-party certifiers, especially in the European Union, that and we homologate vehicles over there as well. I think the difference here in this situation is that they're basing their certification upon the European law. So they've got the ECE regulations. They form their evaluations based on those regulations. So they, I think back to it's almost the chicken before the egg. We don't have the requirement yet for that third-party cert to work.
Right, and I'm the nest, and I'm trying to figure out, is it safe to let that egg plop?
Yeah.
Because the issue becomes, we have to, what's going to happen is we're going to get applications, and then if you think about it, people will be able to start purchasing vehicles, and people will be able to start operating vehicles. And so when we get that application, what are we going to look at to say that, yes, okay, we should grant this application because we DMV are satisfied? And I don't mean to belittle self-certification, but when I hear self-certification, and I've heard that there are no standards, and so what is the standard being judged against? Well, if you just self-certify, what standards are you using to make that self-certification other than the trust us, we say it's safe? And I don't know as a regulator if that's what is intended for us to do when we go to approve that application to start letting vehicles operate.
The other point I wanted to make about the self-certifiers is that, as manufacturers come forward with their applications, and if there is a situation where we can foresee a backlog if there's only one, say, approved certifier, and everybody's trying to rush in and get their applications certified. So I'm not advocating that route, but if that route is ultimately chosen, then I think automakers and manufacturers need options as far as scheduling that.
I think the statute's got a lot of time built into it. The regulations don't become effective for 120 days after we get it approved. And then there's, of course, once we get an application, there's a 180-day lag before we can approve it. So I'm not necessarily saying those periods run simultaneously, but there's almost a 6-month, there is a 6-month period before we can approve an application that would have a vehicle that would operate completely autonomously. So anyway, any other concerns? I think the last item that we had on our outline was vehicle registration requirements. And that goes towards, how should our registration records reflect that a vehicle has some autonomous capability? Should they reflect the level of autonomous capability that a vehicle has, and how should we mark that? And also, some of the questions that we've gotten online is, even after you start getting to that, should there be a requirement that somehow the vehicle has some visible indicator to those outside of it that it is autonomous, or even that it is operating autonomously? So with that, first I'd like, Andrew, if you had any concerns on registration matters, or any comments that you wanted to make, give you an opportunity. If not, I'll just open it up for discussion.
Thank you. The only comment I would make in regard to this is as we've learned more about this subject, I've sort of kind of evolved to the point that I don't really anticipate vehicles that were formerly autonomous. I really kind of see, I guess that's possible with test vehicles, and I think our regulations speak pretty clearly to that. We expect vehicles that are done with testing to be crushed or never again used. But with regard to vehicles that would be out with the general public, I can't imagine, or I've kind of come to where I can't imagine vehicles that were once like this and then had it stripped out. Some people have described it to me as it'd sort of like be removing anti-lock brakes. It's not something you really anticipate seeing. Other than that, I think the outline of what we're thinking about speaks for itself. We think these vehicles need to be marked on their registration records. We understand that vehicles with different levels of capability that may or may not be appropriate in different environments, that should probably be reflected in our records for investigative purposes or for the purposes of law enforcement. And then finally, we think that if a vehicle is truly driverless in the future, that would be the only kind of vehicle that we anticipated having physically marked as different. And the example would be a different kind of license plate, much like a commercial vehicle has a different license plate than a passenger vehicle, though it may not be obvious to lay people.
So Andrew, can I ask, so I understand, I'm just wondering, like, the reason, is it because the reason?
Well, the reason for what?
For a separate license plate for a fully autonomous vehicle, is that because?
Because it's
you want law
truly
enforcement
driverless.
Driverless, yeah, and you want people to understand that that's true. I mean, the license plate's different.
If you saw my vehicle moving with no evidence that there was a person behind the wheel,
You can look at that license plate.
you
know
need
it?
you need to recognize that there's an issue.
I got it, okay.
Whereas if you were to see a vehicle that was truly autonomous,
Yeah.
imagine these vehicles coexisting on the road, you would need to sort of differentiate.
So you can look at the license plate and know right away.
Right.
Got it, okay.
There was a similar tweet that just came over with regard to markings on the vehicle as law enforcement pulls up and tries to pull the vehicle
Yeah,
over.
yeah.
And how would law enforcement realize that it is a driverless vehicle?
Yeah.
And
Because
again,
there's no driver and it pulls over?
well, that dovetails into some of the practical problems that we've been batting about for approximately a year now. Is okay, so that autonomous vehicle got in an accident. How is it exchanging information? That level 4 or level 5 vehicle got in an accident. How is it exchanging information with the other driver? For some reason, a police officer pulls it over. License and registration, please. How does the police officer get that information? And for that matter, as we go to approve this application, how do we address that such that we know those issues are covered?
But you're right, it's not that cut and dried. I mean, one of the questions I have for myself is an autonomous commercial vehicle that's marked that way, like, more susceptible to, say, piracy on the high freeways instead of the seas. But
But don't worry, autonomous commercial vehicles will be the subject of a separate set of regulations.
and we do want to fully vet out this concept, because there was initially some suggestion to just mark autonomous vehicles, and I was very resistant to that. And so I do want to, we want to vet both sides of all these issues.
I mean, we even had the discussions with respect to the testing regulations. Should there be some visible indicator that the vehicle that's being tested is autonomous? And we actually had discussions with law enforcement on it, and I think that the thought process was, well, no. And so now that we're thinking in the same mode of now they're operating, it's not necessarily a trained driver from a manufacturer who probably is a better driver than most of all the rest of us. Should there be some indication to the public that the vehicle is capable of being operated autonomously? And is there any safety benefit from doing that? I'm not sure. Go ahead.
Just had a quick question on the registration requirements. I don't have any specific comments on that, but I was just trying to get, some further background on what's the problem that's trying to be solved. So when we have an ability to comment through written testimony or written comments that, we just understand the question a little bit further.
Sure. There have been a lot of questions raised about insurance products for these vehicles, driver rules and restrictions, and identification of different capabilities that might be meaningful. For example, giving you notice that the vehicle you just bought from your neighbor is an autonomous vehicle. How do we assure that special notifications are conveyed to somebody? And I would liken it not to the same stigma of branding of salvage vehicles, but there are expectations when you buy, for example, a salvage vehicle today, that you're at least aware of that. And the same logic and thought process is that if you have a vehicle that can operate autonomously, that there's a responsibility that the driver or the vehicle owner be aware of that. And that's the primary logic behind marking the vehicles.
Go ahead, Barb.
Couldn't you accomplish that, though, by marking the title?
It's the same thing. In California, the statutes regarding vehicle registration clearly identify the registration card and the title is linked. If there's going to be markings on one of them, there's markings on both of them. And those markings are on our record. And really what we're talking about is marking our records. So if it's your belief that we should mark the record but not the title or not the registration card, two thoughts would be, one, that we get some comment as to why, and then the second would be that we probably might need to address that from a statutory standpoint, because the title and registration card in California are linked by statute in terms of content.
I've had a few conversations about this back home. I think, we're fine with you marking title registration. That makes sense, and for the reasons you explained. But when you comes to putting something on the vehicle that says this is an autonomous vehicle or this is operating,
we're not suggesting that should be done.
Okay.
Right.
We actually, only for truly driverless vehicles.
Any other comments? I'll open it up. If anyone has any matters that we didn't address that they want to specifically bring to our attention, maybe something we already covered that you want to comment further on, I'll give you the opportunity now. I'll pause for a minute or so to see if anybody wants to step up, and if not, I'll just go on and explain what our next steps in the process will be. Long enough pause. Our next steps. From here, we have the fun task of trying to, of actually physically drafting the regulations. Based on timing, it's something that we will have to get to work on really rapidly. And when I say based on timing, it was, I wasn't joking when I talked about the time frames. A 45-day notice takes so long. It takes so long before a 45-day notice can be published, so it takes an additional 10 days for that. And then the OAL review process is another 45 days. So if you just think about it, in reviews and notifications, we've lost in excess of, 95 days. So 3 months are gone. And so that means that our task is exacerbated. If you think about it, this has to be approved by January 1. We're basically at a mode that we'd have to submit our regulations to the Office of Administrative Law by the fall. So with that, we're going to be working on what the text of the regulations will be next. Once we complete that, we'll do a notice, it'll be published in the notice register. And since you all are all signed up as attendees here, you will actually get a copy of that as soon as we flash it out. From there, there will be a 45-day public comment period. On the close of that, we will have, again, a public session to come in and give comments on it. So you can provide written comments and then, of course, come in and give us oral comments with respect to the regulations. If the comments that we receive after that require us to make some substantive changes, we would be required to issue an additional 15-day notice of the changed text, similar to what we've done already with the testing regulations. And then after that, it's off to the Office of Administrative Law for approval. Because of the timeframes, you can anticipate that a lot of these things are going to be happening very quickly in the near future. So what is also useful to us, if there's things that we discussed today, as you leave, you have some additional thoughts or comments about it, if you can go ahead and submit those to us, there's an email address on the bottom of the agenda, LAD, and that's capital L, capital A, capital D, regulations, at dmv.ca.gov. We would really appreciate receiving those. All comments are welcome because the task of drafting the regulations is not necessarily going to be an easy one. Go ahead, Mr. Sorge.
Hi, Brian. I'm Sam Sorge with the Barger Wolin Law Firm. You know, I was going over my notes and looking at the agenda. I don't know that we addressed, at least directly, the insurance issue. Did we?
No, we didn't, and it is somewhat of a complex issue.
Sure.
Because if you start thinking about how insurance is rated, and it's rated on the characteristics of a driver, how do you rate a policy or have a product for a vehicle that's driverless? And then how do you have a policy that's for that hybrid? You know, what's going to happen? You know, we talked about the parking valet, but the car in the parking valet got in an accident, and our insurer is going to say, that's not covered. So I think it's something that's going to have to be addressed. I don't know if we can necessarily address it in our regulations. Thank you.
Nicole?
Hi, Nicole Baranko with Volkswagen Group. I know you're going to make every attempt to make the January 1st deadline, and so
We will
we.
make the January 1st deadline.
Okay. I was just going to ask, what happens if by chance we didn't? Because I think we're all interested in getting it right rather than getting it on time, and I know it's possible to do both, so.
I think a big black hole opens up under this building and we just go. No. The statute doesn't have any consequences,
Okay.
but there's always consequences.
Sure.
I can't tell you what they are, but for us, it says we have to get it done by January 1, 2015.
Got it.
It'll be there.
Hey, Brian, do you have an idea then when you would expect for us to see a proposal?
Well, I mean, I forget what our.
We're looking at probably the beginning of summer, about the July timeframe, at the beginning of July. And so with that, we will also be participating in the TRB meeting that's going to be happening in mid-July. And we're working on trying to get a session specifically to discuss these regs. It'll be within the 45-day public comment period, so we need to be really careful about how we handle that. But we are working towards getting a session going for the TRB. So many of you will be in attendance there and be an opportunity to interface again on this set of regs.
Yeah. Often when I think of the regulations, I work backwards from the deadline. And if you think of January 1, if OAL is going to take 45 days to review it, that means, we're looking at mid-November when we would have had to have submitted it. We have our own internal review processes and things like that. So you work backwards from that, a 45-day comment period. We're shooting for having that mid-July-ish, which would mean that backing 45 days out of mid-July, we're talking probably about like the end of May when you would see actual text of the regulation. And those are just me sitting here right now trying to, work my way backwards from January 1. So the anticipation would be probably late spring, really early summer, you would actually see the text of the regulations. Okay. One thing I've been asked before we end, I'd like to thank all of our online viewers, online commenters. We will, and I think for those who are watching us online, one of the ways that you can keep in contact and find out what information that we're putting out when we actually put out the text of the regulations is by visiting our website. We actually have an autonomous vehicles page on our website, so anything that we do with respect to these regulations gets posted there. So for those of you who are not physically present today, you can keep up by basically logging onto our site. Again, I mentioned that the end of the summer type of a mode, so if you want to check back in with us by the beginning of June, there will be probably additional information about where we are.
And then also there's an active group on Reddit. We're crowdsourcing comments. So if you do go to Reddit and you search for self-driving cars, there's a group that's cross-linked with other Reddit users. There's approximately 150,000 folks that have views into it, and so you could also participate that way in providing some comments to us. And we monitor that, and we're watching that. So.
And the other mechanism, for those of you who are linked in, there's a self-driving cars group, I think it's entitled there. Bernard and I try to follow it. We joined it, and so what we're trying to do is, as we announce things, we post them on there as just an additional avenue, so that interested people can see the things that we post. So even if you're watching online, if you happen to join that LinkedIn group, as we post the notices, we're also adding them, posting them there. So we really appreciate everyone who came out today. All of you that participated today. Again, your input is valuable. So I don't want to sound like I'm begging, but as you leave, if you have suggestions for us, we're always open to taking those suggestions. So
Thank you, everybody.
thank you.
Yeah, I'll take it though.